Hello, my name is Dr. Sandhya Raman. I'm a lifestyle medicine doctor, and today I'm going to be talking about the role of the ketogenic diet in weight loss. Now, the ketogenic diet, or keto diet as it's often called, is a really popular approach to losing weight and also managing diabetes. We're going to have a little look at the science in case this is something that you may have considered as an approach to losing weight. But first of all, what is a ketogenic diet? Well, a ketogenic diet is typically one that's very high in fat, about 70% of calories from fat. It has moderate protein, maybe about 20% of calories from protein, and really low in carbohydrates, typically maybe about 10% of calories from carbohydrate. And the whole purpose of a ketogenic diet is to try and shift your body away from using glucose from carbohydrate as a fuel source towards using fat as your fuel source. And the reason it's called a ketogenic diet is one of the breakdown products of fat is ketone bodies. And ketone bodies are necessary because some of our organs in our body, such as our brain and our kidneys, can't use fat as a fuel source. They use glucose as a fuel source, or they can use ketone bodies as a fuel source. And so that's what the ketogenic diet is. Ketogenic diets are often also called low-carb diets, and they are very far from new. Back in 1921, a man called Dr. Russell Wilder noticed that in some of his epileptic patients, when they had been fasting, this reduced how many seizures they had. And one really clever way of tricking the body into thinking it's fasting is a ketogenic diet, because if you don't have carbohydrate, your body thinks you're in starvation mode, and so it switches to creating ketone bodies and burning fat. And so even to this day, ketogenic diets are used in epileptic patients who aren't as effectively responsive to their epileptic medication. Now, aside from this, people also noticed that ketogenic diets are using this very clever metabolic trick to help people lose weight. Because we use insulin to push our glucose into our cells, and because glucose, once it's in our cells, can either be used for energy or it can be stored as glycogen, and when our glycogen stores are overwhelmed, we can store this as fat. So if you don't raise insulin by not having any carbohydrates, you're not going to be storing fat. Also, since if we're not eating carbohydrate, we can't use carbohydrate, which is broken down into glucose, as fuel. We are forced to use fat as fuel, and so a ketogenic diet is going to help us burn fat as our fuel source. So it's clearly, in theory, a win-win for weight loss. Or is it? Interestingly, our bodies prioritize burning fat anyway. In fact, because the amount of glycogen, glucose, that we store is very limited, it can only be stored in our liver and in our muscles, and these have a sort of fixed capacity for storing glucose. We preserve using glucose as our energy source for when we have bursts of energy, when we have an emergency need for it, like if we had to run from a predator or other kind of common emergency events. And so we actually, most of the time when we're at rest, when we're just walking around, we use fat. We burn fat, and we burn it as a priority in just our regular everyday activity. In fact, one of the very key issues with a ketogenic diet for weight loss is that we may not be losing the type of weight that we would like to lose if we go on a weight loss journey. This study, for example, took 20 men and women who had an average BMI of 27.8, but they were otherwise healthy. And all of the participants stayed for 28 days at the National Institute of Health in Maryland, Washington, D.C. During those 28 days, they were divided into two groups. The first group was put on a low carbohydrate, high animal-based ketogenic diet. And the second group was put on a low fat, high carbohydrate, plant-based diet. And they followed these diets for 2 weeks. They were given all of their meals. They were given 3 meals a day, water as a fluid, and they were also given however many snacks they wanted. And they could eat whatever portion size they liked. There was no calorie control. They were just asked to remain within that dietary pattern that they had been allocated to. And they also took a huge number of measurements from them throughout the study. After those 2 weeks, they then swapped the groups over. So the group that had been on the ketogenic animal-based diet was now switched to the low-fat plant-based diet, and the group that had been on the low-fat plant-based diet was now switched to the high animal food ketogenic diet. And then they repeated this for another 2 weeks. They could eat as much as they like as long as they stuck to their dietary pattern, and they took a whole host of measurements from these people. And the reason that they cross over the participants in the trial is so that you remove that individual variability, and therefore we know that any difference we see isn't down to their individual physiology, but is down to the dietary pattern, which is what we're testing. And this is what they found. Everybody lost weight, no matter if they were on the ketogenic diet or on the low-fat plant-based diet. In fact, people in the ketogenic group, which is shown by this red line on this graph, lost weight more quickly, although overall there was no significant difference in the weight loss between the animal-based ketogenic diet group and the plant-based low-fat diet group. Now, you may be looking at the graph and thinking, well, this group on the ketogenic diet, they lost weight more quickly, and maybe they even lost a little bit more weight, even though it wasn't statistically significant. But a really important thing, and here is where the detail matters, is what happened when they put the participants into body scanners. What they found was that the people who had been put on the low-fat plant-based diet lost predominantly fat mass, and meanwhile, the people who were put on the ketogenic diet lost some fat mass, but a significant amount of the weight that they lost was water weight and muscle mass. And that is certainly not what any of us is aiming to do. And this loss of muscle mass on a ketogenic diet is not an isolated finding. It's a really, really common, consistent finding amongst studies when you put people on a ketogenic diet. And it makes a lot of sense. What happens when people go on a ketogenic diet is that, first of all, they will lose water weight. And that is why you get a rapid amount of weight loss to begin with on a ketogenic diet. And that's because you're using up your stored glucose. So you're losing that mass of glycogen, which is your stored glucose. And each molecule of glycogen is attached to 3 molecules of water. So you lose a lot of water weight as well. And that's why you get the quick returns on a ketogenic diet. But that is not fat mass. Beyond that, if you only give your body 2 fuel sources instead of 3, so you've taken away your carbohydrates as your fuel source, it will use fat, but it will also use protein as a fuel source, and it will have to take that protein from our muscles. It does seem, even if you look at people who also go on a ketogenic diet as well as exercise, or who are already weightlifters or have a lot of muscle mass, it does seem to still cause muscle mass loss. And in people who are weight training, it limits how much muscle mass they can build. The other significant risks of a ketogenic diet is it tends to cause an increase in our bad cholesterol, our LDL cholesterol, because a lot of these fatty foods, particularly animal source fats, are high in saturated fats, and there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that just drives our LDL cholesterol, driving a lot of cardiovascular disease. And we see this in cohort studies that people who follow a ketogenic diet tend to have poor cardiovascular outcomes. Some of the other risks of a ketogenic diet includes an increased risk of kidney stones, because you get an increase in uric acid and calcium in the urine, and so you can end up with uric acid kidney stones. And also things like gout from the high animal protein content. So a ketogenic diet overall doesn't seem to be that beneficial in terms of losing the right amount of weight, and it also carries with it other health risks in the middle to long term. On the other hand, ketones and ketosis can be healthy, and probably the healthiest way to do that is through something like intermittent fasting. And have a look at my video on intermittent fasting to learn more about this and the benefits of it, because naturally we all go into ketosis when we haven't eaten for a period. And so if we extend our overnight fast, we naturally go into ketosis. So we can get the benefits of ketosis without having the negatives of a ketogenic diet. Thank you very much. I hope you found this video useful.